The competitive Warhammer 40,000 scene is on the cusp of another meta shift, with points updates for every faction in the game looming. So it's a good time to pause and reflect on how the world leaders have been doing since the January Balance Dataslate. Today, we're going to focus on tournament statistics and what kind of a story they tell us about how the world leaders have been doing. So grab yourselves a brew and let's get into this video of competitive insights. Welcome back to the Red Path. My name is Dara and today I will be diving deep into world leader performances since the January Balance Dataslate. We are merely weeks away from the next balance update, which will most likely be a Munitorum field manual that alters point values for units across the board. This will cause the meta to change significantly, with several codexes hitting the table at the same time. It's going to be quite the upheaval. So, before this chaotic tempest strikes, let's take a moment to reflect on how the world leaders have been doing since the last update in January. I'm going to break down our factions tournament dataset and try to build a picture of the overall health of the world leaders in the competitive scene. This will involve examining win rates and player performances, factoring in a host of variables which influence these numbers, and establishing a sensible narrative around these statistics. If you're watching this video, you've probably seen Games Workshop's MetaWatch series, which is a nice top-down view of the state of the game, but it fails to tell the full story, often obscuring a lot of information behind simple statistics. It's important to note that numbers can be deceiving, and a win rate percentage can hide a lot of valuable information. To unearth as much of the story as possible, I'll be examining more than just the average win rate for the faction, taking a look at how we do into specific meta armies and analysing differences in performance across player skill levels and geographic regions. This is all possible thanks to the comprehensive meta dashboard provided by 40k StatCheck, so I want to give them a shout out for all the hard work they do to curate and refine the database. I'll also include a link to the meta dashboard in the video description, so feel free to have a play with it if you're interested, or use it to follow along with this video. Of course, numbers aren't everything. We also have to be able to digest this information and shape it into a story which makes sense. Thankfully, this is something I do during my daytime job, so I'll be doing my best to construct an accurate narrative while diving into these statistics. I think you'll find that the story which emerges is quite interesting and highlights some of the main issues facing world leader players in the current meta. So, let's ease ourselves into the tale and kick things off with a top-down overview of our win rates since January. The data I'm looking at here is taken from tournaments across the world which have a minimum of 5 rounds and 25 players. Of course, this doesn't consider RTT size events, but these are particularly difficult to analyze due to a higher variance and are somewhat problematic due to their random nature. But working with this pool of available data, we have a lot to dig through, and the first thing to look at is the overarching player numbers and win rates. Since the January Balance Dataslate, almost 1,300 games have been played by world leader players, which is a very healthy number when trying to infer any sort of conclusion from statistics and data. Generally speaking, the higher the number of games or reps, the more reliable the data becomes. In this case, we have a grand total of 1,126 games played as world leaders, and as of time of recording, we are sitting at an overall win rate of 46%. This win rate is considered acceptable by Games Workshop, as it falls within their buffer zone of a desired 50% win rate with a 10% margin. However, this is quite the decline from the previous balance season, both in terms of win rate and size of the player pool, where world leaders were sitting at a 53% win rate with a total of 2,600 games played. On the surface, this may seem like world leaders are struggling and have taken a bit of a hit, but are relatively okay in the current meta. But when we dig deeper, does that still hold up? Well, let's find out. The first thing we can look at is how this win rate is distributed across events, and by that I mean what percentage of players are finishing an event with X wins and Y losses. The good news here is that our performance at events follows what we would consider a fairly normal distribution of data. Normally distributed data will form a bell-shaped curve under which the majority of the dataset will be grouped around the middle of this curve with outliers to either end. In the context of event performances, this means at a typical 5-round GT, World Leader players would mostly be finishing up at 2 and 3 or 3 and 2, with fringe performances on the upper and lower end. Superimposing our results over a normal distribution, we can see that this is pretty close to that ideal state, though it is still slightly skewed towards the left, meaning that there is more World Leader players finishing up with losing records than those finishing with winning records. Over a third of our players have finished up with a 2-3 record, which isn't too bad, but we would like to see that a bit more evenly spread across the 2-3, 3-2 brackets. One worrying data point here is that 7% of the player base finished an event with 0 wins, which is a sizable portion. This contrasts heavily with the opposite end of the spectrum, where we can see that a total of 38% of the entire player base are finishing with positive results, and only 2% of the player base are finishing an event with either 5 or 6 wins. This imbalance is part of what is skewing our win rate downwards, but it isn't the full picture, and as we go on, you might see some worrying trends in our data, which could make balancing our army quite problematic. My takeaway from these stats is that though we are falling within the threshold of balance by GW's standard, there is clear evidence that our faction is struggling, and the majority of players are finishing events with a negative win-loss record. Furthermore, we seem to be really struggling to win events, with it being much more likely that, on average, a World Leader players will lose all their games than win all of them. We can take this slightly further thanks to the meta dashboard, and see how these trends fluctuate across geographical regions. The reason why this is interesting is because different metas evolve in different regions of the world. This is largely driven by terrain and table layouts, but regional playstyles have an impact too, though this is less tangible and harder to quantify. Let's look at North America first. Firstly, the overall win rate in this region is higher than the global average, sitting at 49%. Using a statistical test called a z-score, I checked to see if this would be considered a statistically significant difference from the global average, and it isn't, given the size of the dataset, but it's still got some interesting points to note. Namely, there's a higher proportion of players finishing with 3 wins over those finishing with 2, and a much greater proportion of players finishing with X and 1 or X and O records, suggesting that World Leader players in North America are faring slightly better than the global average. Moving to Europe next, we see a slight drop in the overall win percentage, down to 45%, and this can be explained by almost half of the entire dataset finishing with a 2-3 record at an event. Similar to the global average, we can see a relatively high number of players finishing out with no wins, and a very small minority finishing on X and 1 or X and O. Finally, looking at the United Kingdom, we can see that World Leaders are struggling here, with an average win rate dropping to 42% and a tighter clustering of data around the 2-3 event record. Though the number of players finishing with no wins is lower, we have no players finishing events undefeated here, indicating that top table performances generally end in a loss for our faction in the UK. One of the main talking points here is how World Leaders' viability changes a lot on different terrain layouts. In North America, GW layouts are favoured for the most part, and these are widely considered to be advantageous to combat-centric armies, which could explain the higher win percentages and better event results in the States. Europe favours WTC formats or the UKTC format for the most part, and though these are quite different from each other, both offer open firing lanes, which makes things more challenging for a combat army. In particular, UKTC terrain is believed to favour shooting armies, which could explain why World Leaders are struggling the most in the United Kingdom. Additionally, Europe and the UK generally favour a more passive, slow-paced style of Warhammer, which can be detrimental to a World Leaders player. On the other hand, the aggressive playstyle of the North American meta can often play into a World Leader's hands, since we are one of the most aggressive armies in the game. In summary, though there are interesting points to note when it comes to regional differences, we aren't observing any statistically significant difference within any of these regions, so we can conclude that the average global win rate isn't being skewed in one direction by any specific region. This is good news, since it means the discussion we have around balancing World Leaders isn't limited or inapplicable to any specific region, and no one area will be disproportionately affected by any change. Before we close out the discussion on the overall win rate, Let's have a look at how that win rate has been trending as the weeks have gone on since the January Dataslate. There's some good news in here, as it looks like our win rate is trending upwards. A fairly grim start to the season saw world leaders sitting in the low 30%, but we've been steadily climbing, crossing the 40% mark at the end of February and peaking 50% at the end of March. When we look at trends across the previous season and this season combined, we can see a steep decline at the beginning of the January season when compared to the previous, but that we are beginning to climb back to a level which is close to where we were before, albeit slightly below our previous highs. At a glance, it does seem like the win rate is starting to stabilize, somewhere in the high 40s, but the limited number of data points makes it difficult to predict if this is an actual trend or if the win rate will begin climbing or descending again. Though this may be conjecture, I think some of this can be attributed to the dedication of die-hard world leader players over the last couple of months, striving to find ways to compete in the current meta. Here on the Red Path, we've had a lot of insightful videos with players who have been performing well at events, and all of them have had drastically different approaches with their list design and playstyle. The likes of Brian Doherty and Ryan Bell have been spearheading innovation with Angron lists, championing the rise of 3 damage lacerators to counter the Castos Uprising, while Michael and his triple Mauler Fiend list brought something to the table that no one was expecting. Additionally, the North American scene has witnessed a resurgence of the Lord of Skulls, and even here in Ireland, I've been finding good success with non-Grand Demon Prince lists. As a community, we've been combing the index, looking for new ideas and coming up with unique solutions. All of this speaks to me of the continuous drive to adapt and conquer, a trait which I've long believed to be integral to the World Leaders community spirit. The initial low win rates correspond with a combination of pessimism and player drop-off following the Balance Dataslate, but we can clearly see that as time has gone on, people have refined and adapted their World Leader lists, and this is something which I think is a really positive takeaway from the data. Unfortunately though, there is an ugly underbelly lurking beneath these numbers, so let's look at that next. This next section will focus heavily on variance caused by individual player skill within the World Leaders dataset. Player skill in Warhammer is a difficult metric to accurately quantify, and we have several global leaderboards which attempt to capture this. Most commonly used is the ITC leaderboard, but this relies on players attending as many events as possible in a given year and also factors in RTTs, where an individual can dominate a smaller local scene and accrue a high score quickly. StatCheck uses a more refined approach in the ELO system, an adapted metric commonly used in competitive chess circuits. The full description of how this works is on their website, but it essentially ranks you based on the caliber of opponents you are beating or losing to, adjusting your overall score accordingly. Their meta dashboard now has a filter which allows you to sort the stats based on player ELO, and when we dive into this for World Leaders, some interesting trends begin to emerge. For this section, I'm going to be talking a lot about quartiles, which are a way of splitting a dataset into 4 sections called percentiles using 3 points, the lower, median, and upper quartiles. This is useful for grouping and analyzing player ELO and how that relates to win rates. You would naturally expect a balanced army to have the majority of players falling within the 2nd and 3rd percentile, which would be considered average skill players, with a smaller portion of the player base to either the lowest or highest percentile, which captures lower and higher skilled individuals respectively. However, this type of data clustering is not what we observe for World Leaders in the current meta. Mid-ELO players, i.e. the players which fall between the 2nd and 3rd percentile, contributed only 288 games of the 1,126 games played since January, whereas players in the lowest percentile contributed 393 games, and players in the highest percentile contributed 445 games to the overall World Leaders win rate. I was extremely surprised when I saw this, and we can draw a couple of conclusions from this information. Firstly, this tells us that the people playing World Leaders in the current meta are, for the most part, either relatively low skilled or quite highly skilled, with a smaller group of what would be considered average skilled players in the middle. This indicates that a substantial number of players are either relatively inexperienced with the faction and not finding much success with them, or are faction specialists who have mastered the army and know how to pilot it well. The lower number of mid-level players also indicates a high drop-off rate of newcomers who, after discovering that world leaders are not particularly easy to play, pivot elsewhere. It also tells us that our faction is unappealing to the majority of average skill players. This becomes problematic when we consider how this affects the overall faction win rate, as there is a huge gulf between the win rates of the lowest and highest percentiles of players, who are the primary pools contributing to this value. Let's look at that now. For the time being, we're going to evaluate specific ELO percentiles for the world leader players against the entire population of opponent ELO levels, but we will dive into more specific matchups where we pair equally skilled opponents shortly. Let's start with the good side of things and look at the upper percentile. This is the top 75% of world leader players in the world. We can see a dramatic deviation here from the average win rate, rocketing up to 65%. 80% of this player pool are finishing events with a positive record, with a very high number going X and 1 or X and 0. This tells us that, in the hands of a skilled pilot, world leaders are still a strong army in the current meta. This sharply contrasts with the opposite end of the player pool, and when we examine the lower 25% of world leader players, the win rate plummets to 26%. This is telling us that the less skilled players are really struggling with world leaders, with only 4% of their total pool finishing an event with a positive record, and none with an X and 1 or better record. Now, it can be fairly argued that there will of course be a difference between the best and worst players in a given faction, but a differential win rate of 40% is very high, and when both of these pools are contributing the most to world leader games in the current meta, it impacts the overall win percentage a lot. In the middle percentiles, or what would be considered the average skill level, we see that their data maps fairly evenly onto the average win percentage for the entire faction, with this group standing at a 45% win rate and the majority of players finishing an event at the 2 and 3 mark. At the very least, this indicates that balance changes to this group should shift them in the direction that GW wants the army to go, but the large population of lower and higher ELO players merit some discussion regarding balance updates. If GW takes some of this data at surface level and decides that world leaders need a boost in the next balance pass, this will have very different effects on the various percentile groups within the overall player base. We can clearly see that the higher skilled players are not struggling with world leaders in their current form, and a boost in power could skew their win percentages into dangerous territory, surpassing the 65% threshold and becoming a very menacing force in the right hands. Conversely, a slight boost in power will do very little for those who are struggling the most with the army right now. It likely won't feel like a meaningful change for these players, and probably won't improve overall player retention for the faction, meaning the numbers may become even more confusing. For those in the middle, it will probably feel pretty good. They might get a slight lift, and I think we could expect to see the 2-3, 3-2 results mirror, with the majority of these players finishing events with a positive record overall, and some of them even being able to push for X and 1 or higher results. The net result of this is that we will probably see an uptick in top placings, podiums, and event wins for the world leaders, as the players who are already doing fine capitalize on buffs, while those who can't seem to make the faction work will likely be left frustrated by their own performances. This is partly why I believe the world leaders are a particularly difficult faction to balance, since there is high internal variance within our player pool, and changes to the army affect that pool very differently depending on where you are within it. To close out the section on player ELO within the world leaders faction, we can adjust the dataset to pair our players against those of similar ELO and see how we do when facing opposition of equal skill. This is where things get a bit fun. The meta dashboard actually has its own mini section on this called peer versus peer, but it uses their older metric which divides players into newcomers up to veterans, depending on the amount of events they've attended, and then analyzes newcomer versus newcomer games and vet v vet games, plotting them against each other to arrive at a graph which somewhat accurately defines the overall state of the faction. In this analysis, we can see that world leaders are drifting close to this definition of perfectly balanced and lurking in the mid-table menace quadrant. Personally, I think this is actually a pretty accurate summation of where we are right now, but let's comb through the numbers using ELO again. Starting in the lowest percentile of ELO players, when we pair our faction against all other players in the bottom 25% ELO, we see the average win rate jump from 26% to 49%. This is somewhat healthier and indicates that when a less experienced player comes up against an equally less experienced player, it's a bit of a coin toss. You might infer from this that it comes down to whether or not the world leader player went first in that matchup. Who's to say? I certainly wouldn't suggest such things anyway. When we take a peek at the middle percentiles versus players of equal skill, we see that it ends in yet another dead draw, landing at a 50% win rate, again indicating that your average player is about as likely to win their game as lose it when they cross paths with an equally skilled opponent. Perfectly balanced and wonderful. However, when we look at the upper percentile of world leader players against equally skilled opponents, we discover that this is where folks get found out. Their win rate drops from a 65% overall to a 46% in this data pool, telling us that while they have a good time in the overall field, they are still struggling against equally competent opponents. This likely comes down to these opponents having a high amount of reps and familiarity with playing against world leaders, and are aware of their tricks and potential for first turn charging. I've experienced this firsthand myself. There's a dramatically different game played when I pair into someone who understands the threat of my army versus an opponent who doesn't respect it or is less familiar with how they play. I think this is actually a big contributory factor as to why world leaders have been unable to close out events and win them, or even reach regular podium placings. A good Eaters player can coast through the initial rounds, but once they float to the top, they sometimes get knocked down by skilled opposition. Overall, I think examining ELO gives us a really interesting and nuanced breakdown of the overall win rate and how it can be quite deceptive. While it may have initially seemed that the majority of our players are averaging out in tournaments, the reality is that our player pool is dominated by two groups, high and low ELO players, with dramatically different win percentages in each group. As I've highlighted, this will make balancing the army a real challenge for Games Workshop, and I'm curious to see how they approach it, especially as the entire meta will change as other armies get tuned up or down. But let's move on to talking about those other armies, specifically which of those factions are proving troublesome for world leaders and which are easy wins. The meta dashboard has a handy function which shows how the world leaders match up against all the other factions in the game. Here, red indicates an unfavorable match, while blue is favorable and grey represents a more even playing field. The bigger the box, the more games into that faction that have been played, making that data more reliable. A quick glance shows us that a lot of the factions fall into that greyish unknown, where player skill will heavily influence the outcome, whereas some of the factions skew heavily in favour or against us. But there's also a lot of shades of red, telling us that a lot of factions in the game are somewhat problematic. Two of the meta bogeymen right now, Castos and Necrons, are right up there as some of our toughest games, sitting at 34 and 36% win rates respectively. We also seem to be struggling into other combat focused armies, with sub 50% win rates into Orcs, Templars, Blood Angels, Demons and Space Wolves, who are apparently our toughest matchup as we put up only a 25% win rate into them. In good news, we seem to have excellent play into Tyranids, at our most reliable win rate of 69%, followed by Guard, Knights and Drukhari. All in all, it's a pretty mixed bag, but I do find it interesting that the melee matchups are our biggest pain point. This could be due to a variety of factors, including our high points cost making the melee trading game particularly challenging, or those less experienced world leader players overcommitting too early with their army and getting punished hard. Let's touch briefly on that and see if it holds true when we apply ELO parameters to faction matchups. Investigating the lower 25% ELO of world leader players, we can see that the Sea of Blood does flow, and Khorne definitely cares not in this case. A lot of the lowest win percentages here are those melee matchups, with the likes of Custodes, Blood Angels, Templars and Wolves all sub 20%. Of course, Necrons prove very challenging in this group, which is not surprising. it does possibly support my theory that less experienced World Leader players become victims of the Mash W philosophy and end up overextending into these combat armies, which have room to riposte and counter thanks to their higher unit count. Shifting the needle to the upper 75% of World Leader players, we can see that those combat matchups invert and become much more favourable, though we are still struggling into Wolves, and Orcs seem to also be a menace still, even for these higher skilled players, which is amusing to me. However, it does indicate that the practice and familiarity with the army means the melee v melee matchup becomes less of an uphill struggle. Particularly, the twin bogeymen, Custodes and Necrons, seem to become much more manageable at this level, and it's actually quite a dramatic swing in the case of Custodes, shifting from a 19% win rate for the lower percentile to a 55% win rate for the upper percentile. Since Custodes are so prevalent in the meta right now and are a particular pain point for World Leader players, I decided to drill down into this statistic and find out what was going on to cause such a deviation. I've been a firm believer that World Leaders are capable of winning the Custodes matchup, even having made a comprehensive video on key techniques to overcome the boys in gold, but the stats are indicating that we are definitely still struggling into this faction. Across the entire population of both factions, we are posting a 34% win rate into Custodes, which falls well below our average of 46%, but there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. As we've seen, the lower elo percentile is really struggling in this matchup, posting a 19% win rate into the Custodes population, and the lower mid percentile isn't holding up much better, reaching only 13%. Things don't really improve with the upper mid percentile, which rises to 20% win rate, but we then see a dramatic jump to a 55% win rate when we move to the highest percentile. I think this can be explained pretty simply. Higher skilled World Leader players are practiced and aware of the Custodes game, and know the tricks we can employ to neuter them. If this is a matchup you are struggling with, I do suggest you watch my video on the subject, because I cover all those little tips and tactics there. Of course, we have to consider equally skilled players in this equation, and things do shift slightly when we bring that into the picture. Specifically focusing on that upper percentile for a moment, when we match that into equally skilled Custodes players, the win rate drops from 55% to 37%, telling us that when all things become equal, the matchup still favours the Custodes player, but there is a chance the World Leaders player can pull it out of the bag. This isn't particularly surprising when it comes to melee matchups between high skilled players. Normally, the player with more tricks in the bag tends to win. This trend is not observed in the middle percentiles, which don't shift much when skill is factored into the equation, and in the lower percentile group the data isn't strong enough to provide meaningful information. So what can we take away from this? Well, it seems like Custodes is a real struggle for World Leaders, unless the pilot is one of the top skilled players, and even then, if they run into an equally skilled opponent, it's going to be a very tough game. It certainly reinforces the belief that Custodes are a big stat check type army for our faction, and due to their prevalence in the meta, as can be seen by the proportion of games played into them, they are probably a big part of what is actually suppressing our overall win rate. Before we close out this section, let's do a similar analysis on the other prevalent faction, the Necrons. Overall, we are in a similar position here as that of the Custodes, posting a 36% win rate far below our average. This, paired with Custodes, is probably a big factor as to why our win rate is being suppressed, since they both make up a high relative proportion of matchups. The lower elo percentile struggles into Necrons, which isn't very surprising. They have a lot of tricks which will definitely catch out a newer player who hasn't had the reps into the faction. But as we move into the higher elo percentile, things don't really improve as dramatically as they did with Custodes, and we reach only a 47% win rate average, and when we assume equal skill here, that drops to a 36% average. All of this indicates that even though we may complain more about Custodes, Necrons are actually proving to be a more punishing army for us to play into, regardless of player skill. We could do this for a lot of the factions in the game, but I decided to focus on the two most common armies that are out there right now, and it seems that they are contributing quite heavily to driving down our win rate. This begs the question, should these armies receive nerfs, what will that do for the World Leaders? It depends on a host of factors, but as always, when the main predator is taken out, something else will move to take its place. It's possible that we will manage to move into that slot, but it's also equally likely that another faction, like Death Guard for example, become our next big problem. I don't want to come through every faction analysis right now, since that would take a really long time, but I would encourage you to play around with the meta dashboard if there are particular faction matchups that you're interested in tracking. Just make sure there's enough games that have been played in those matchups for the numbers to be reliable. But let's move on now to combining all this data into a discussion and conclusion about where the world leaders are in the current meta. Well, we've run the numbers on this one, and I think we have quite an interesting story built up. The way I see it, we have an average win rate, which is just within acceptable parameters by GW standards, but how we arrived at that win rate over the last season is a problem in and of itself. The data is telling us that the majority of World Leader players are either very experienced and skilled veterans or relative newcomers to the tournament scene, with very few of the mid-table players actually picking up and running with this army. This causes the data to polarize in two directions, with the stronger players seeing relatively good success, while the weaker players are having a very difficult time. This sort of reinforces the idea that World Leaders are an army with a relatively high skill floor and ceiling, meaning they are not an easy army to learn and see success with, despite the perception that we are a single brain cell, go forward and charge army. In fact, that mentality could very well be part of the reason why newer players are seeing poorer results with the faction. A lot of the wider discussion around World Leaders on social media involves telling people to mash W and run at the enemy. However, in practice, this requires a certain amount of nuance and understanding of the game state. Better players tend to only go for these plays if the opportunity is too good to pass up, and many will prefer a slower paced push method. Unless of course you're Ryan Bell, who adamantly champions that full send mentality and still manages to get results, though even this requires tactical precision in where you apply that pressure. The data is clearly telling us that World Leaders are a difficult army to learn and then master, but if you do get to that stage, you will probably see good success. This is evident in the high win percentage of our top ELO players, which again presents a new problem when it comes to balance. If GW decides that our overall faction win rate is just low enough that we warrant a slight buff, which is what I will expect will happen, this will have a disproportionate effect for the players who are already doing well with the army. In fact, if specific bogeymen like Custodes and Necrons get heavily nerfed, we could actually step into their place and become a problem in the meta. A combination of a light buff and the removal of armies which present a considerable obstacle would give our best players an open shot at the podium in a tournament. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, good players should always be in with a chance of winning, but I wonder, will it drive a confused narrative across the faction, where less skilled players will be unable to replicate the success of stronger players and be left confused as to where they are going wrong? Overall though, I think this insight into the breakdown of our win rate and performances suggests that GW have a difficult task on their hands when it comes to balancing our army. How can they bring back the mid-table players to the faction without dramatically skewing the top end of our performances into dangerous territory? How can they make the army feel better in the hands of a newer player without providing too much strength to our faction veterans? Given that we are likely to only receive points updates in the next balance pass, I think there isn't enough nuance available to adjust the balance levers accordingly. Points won't solve the issue our army currently faces, both in significantly raising our win rates and making the army feel better to play. The stats speak to a deeper issue, one which is endemic to a few factions right now. Simply put, we don't have a deep enough pool of data sheets, nor fair rules to complement them. There's no doubt that our army rules are very powerful, but they are exponentially more powerful when in the hands of a strong player. I can't say that I'm optimistic that this next balance update will solve some of these issues. I think we are quite likely to see our win rate rise overall, but that isn't really an adequate solution for the majority of the player base. Further, it drives a sort of social divide between our stronger players and those in the mid to low ELO percentiles, risking a split within the faction, and that's something I definitely don't want to see for the World Leaders. That said, I am very interested in how GW approach this problem, and I'd love to know if you have suggestions or ideas for how this could be improved upon. For now though, I will bring this to a conclusion. I hope this has been an insightful and interesting video, and if you folks enjoyed the content, do let me know. I'd like to make more of these for future balance seasons, so make sure you comment below if you want to keep up with this sort of information. If you want to support what we do here on the Red Path, you can check out our Patreon link below, which will give you access to our Patreon competitive group on Discord, where we dive deep into this sort of stuff on a regular basis. And As always, just liking and subscribing goes a long way into keeping the channel growing. Once again, a shout out to StatCheck for making this data available and curating it in a user-friendly way, which made this video a lot of fun to make. We've got lots more coming up in the future, so make sure you stay tuned on the Red Path. And as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.